In Australia, there remains considerable confusion around the Astra Zeneca vaccine after the Prime Minister encouraged younger people to talk to their GPs about getting the shot. Astra Zeneca has been linked to very rare but potentially deadly blood clots. Right now, though, it's the only vaccine we have in abundance in Australia. It's being manufactured here. It's been administered, in fact, to hundreds of millions of people around the world, and it's the leading vaccine still in the UK, where it's been effective against hospitalisation and death from COVID. Now, the scientists behind AstraZeneca have written their story about how they developed the vaccine. Their book is called Vaxxers, the inside story of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the race against the virus. The authors are Professor Sarah Gilbert and Dr. Catherine Green, and they joined me earlier from London. Sarah Gilbert, Catherine Green, welcome to Breakfast.
Hello, thank you.
Sarah, you recently and famously received a standing ovation at Wimbledon in honour of your work in developing the AstraZeneca vaccine. At any moment during the enormous 18 months you've just had developing this vaccine for the world in world record time, did you expect that kind of recognition for your work, at the tennis no less?
No, I had absolutely no idea that was going to happen. Even when I got to Wimbledon and was sitting in the royal box, I had no expectation of anything of that sort happening. But I think it was a recognition of the work that so many of us have put into this project over the last 18 months, not just the people developing the vaccine, the people involved in volunteering to take part in the trials and rolling out the vaccine. And it's made a big difference. And I think that's why people were so excited about it.
How did you feel at that moment? What did that feel like?
Well, I was quite surprised that was happening, and I wasn't really quite sure what to make of it.
Catherine, what did you think when you saw that?
Well, I saw it on Twitter like a lot of people because it hit Twitter quite rapidly in the UK. And it was lovely to see. Sarah is not a person who automatically takes credit for things. And it's nice to see her efforts being recognised. And all of the team do know that she stands as a spokesperson for them and they feel the accolades that she gets. It's really nice to see.
It's rare for scientists to be celebrities or hailed as celebrities. Watching on, Catherine, did you take heart from that? It's clear in the book, the frustrations you all feel of not getting enough funding, not getting it early enough, quickly enough. Do you feel like something shifted?
We don't want to be celebrities, I think there's a difference between putting ourselves out there to be quizzed on what we're doing, to explain and to present. But our job is in the lab, doing the science, getting the information out to the world. But it's nice to be recognised for having done something big this year.
Well, let's go to what you have done, both of you and your teams. Sarah, you first came across COVID-19 on New Year's Day 2020. You were reading an article about 4 people in China with strange pneumonia. That's the very start of what turned out to be a global pandemic. Most of us had no idea of what was coming for a long time yet. But 3 days later, you were convinced there was a problem and you were already thinking about a vaccine. What was it that you read that concerned you and got you working?
Well, I've been working on developing vaccines against diseases that cause outbreaks for a while. And in the last few years, the WHO have encouraged us to think about how we would respond to disease X. So that's the new pathogen that's going to emerge from somewhere. We don't know what it is. We haven't seen it before, but we need a vaccine against it quickly. So I've been putting some time into thinking about how we would deal with disease X. So it wasn't a new concept for me. And then when I was reading the reports of a new pneumonia of unknown origin, I was thinking, is this it? Or is it something that we already know about? So I was following the story over the next few days, and gradually more details emerged. And it turned out that it's a coronavirus. And that meant it was fairly familiar to me because I'd already been working against developing a vaccine against another coronavirus, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So because I'd worked on that vaccine, I knew how to set about starting to make a vaccine against a new coronavirus.
Because, from a distance, and it's something I've had so many conversations about with friends and family, how do you make a vaccine? So something appears in the world, how do you physically make a vaccine? And you do an incredible job at explaining that in the book, both of you. And Catherine, your job is actually to make it in terms of actually cook it in a sense and produce it. And you describe the process in the book as, quote, as if you're making a roast dinner and for every ingredient, this is how the normal process goes. You make a separate trip to the shops to buy it, you cook it, you demonstrate it's going to be delicious along every step of the way. But you say in this case we were allowed to do a big shop all at once, put all the ingredients we needed in the trolley, and then, you know, effectively you came back and what normally take 10 years took 65 days to go from DNA construct to clinical trial. Catherine, can I get your version for everyone listening of how you make a vaccine? What goes into it?
Of course. So we're specifically talking about an adenovirus vectored vaccine. So this is the platform that Sarah's been developing with scientists at the Jenner over the last 10 years. And so Sarah doesn't need to ever come into contact with the virus that causes COVID. The DNA sequence of that is enough. We just need the code of the spike protein, and Sarah can order a DNA sequence which can be slotted in to the adenovirus backbone, and then I can then receive that DNA and from that introduce it into a human cell. It will create a harmless, replication incompetent virus particle, which is the vaccine. I can then grow that in the laboratory, lots and lots and lots of it, under extremely well-controlled conditions, because this is a medicine that's going to go into people. And you end up with a harmless virus, which is a delivery mechanism. It brings the instructions to make a little piece of the COVID-19 spike protein inside your body, and then your immune system does the rest.
Such a beautiful explanation. Sarah, you say in the book that, quote, for the rest of my life, people will ask me how I felt at the moment I heard about the trial results for our vaccine. So let me ask you that question now. How did you feel when you see the results of AstraZeneca's success?
Relieved, but a little bit confused, I think. We'd already by that point heard that the Pfizer vaccine was very highly effective. So that was great news because we knew it was possible to make a vaccine that was going to be effective. And again, we got data that showed it was an effective vaccine, but we got two different numbers. So when in one group of people, we had higher efficacy than in another group of people. And it took some time to really understand that. So that was the slightly confusing part about it.
And do you think that had something to do then with the bad rap that followed? Because success was quickly followed by criticism attack in the press. I mean, you even had US infectious diseases czar Anthony Fauci asking why anyone would want to receive your vaccine, given the results you got, when it didn't compare favourably with Pfizer or Moderna. How did you take that criticism, both on a professional and personal level?
Well, it turned out that the data we generated, and it was to do with different intervals between the two doses of the vaccine, that's been really useful in using the vaccine, because what the UK policy was to give the first dose of the vaccines to as many people as possible and then wait 12 weeks to give the second dose. And we had data showing that was actually a very effective strategy to use. And if we hadn't generated the data in clinical trials, we wouldn't have known that. And then when we started to see the real world effectiveness data, so that's how well are the vaccines performing when they're used on a large scale across the population, the two vaccines were performing to exactly the same level. Both of the vaccines were keeping 80% of 80-year-olds out of hospital when they'd had only a single dose, which was a really great result. And actually, it was almost impossible to tell the difference between the two vaccines as we started to look at their use in the real world.
Well, of course, use in the real world has also brought something else. And the fact is AstraZeneca is still not approved by the FDA in the United States. It's still suspended in several European countries due to concerns about blood clotting conditions. It's still one of the main concerns for health professionals here in Australia, though it always comes with a caveat, this is a minuscule risk. But, Sarah, is it fair enough for health experts and citizens to be concerned about the clotting associated with your AstraZeneca vaccine?
Well, this was something that we didn't start to see until the vaccines have been used in millions of doses, because it's such a rare occurrence that it didn't ever happen in the clinical trials when we had tens of thousands of people immunised. So, of course, we are very concerned to follow up and get a better understanding of what's going on, to understand who it's affecting, and in the future, we hope to understand why this happens, but we're not at that point yet. We talk in the book about risk-benefit analysis, and there's nothing that we do that is without risk, and it's also risky in many occasions not to do anything at all. So we have to weigh up the risks and the benefits. And what the JCVI did in the UK, that's the body that decides on the policy of the vaccine, is that as the risk from COVID decreased, the that meant that the vaccine was not going to be used in people under the age of 40, but it's still recommended for use in people over the age of 40. The risk is extremely small, and the risks from COVID vastly outweigh the risks from taking the vaccine. So it's a complicated situation, which is something that we hope will be clearly communicated to populations. But when there's a lot of virus transmission, the risk-benefit analysis is clearly in favour of receiving the vaccine.
So have you gone back to the drawing board to try and make the vaccine safer?
We haven't gone back to the drawing board yet because we still need to understand the phenomenon behind this very rare event. And because it is so rare, it makes it very difficult to understand it. And there have been a few people who published their own ideas, all of them different. And we're following up to find out what the real cause of these very rare events is so that we can then work out what to do about it.
Catherine, it's a life-saving drug and hero in your own country. But as I said, it's feared and shunned in so many places. How do you see that response? Do you see it as overblown hysteria? Do you see it as political? Do you understand it?
I think that it's really important as scientists that we get the information that is true and correct out there to policymakers, and everybody has to be aware that everybody's risk and benefit scenario will be different. I don't think that we're doing anything differently from any of the other vaccine manufacturers in that we're getting all of the correct and accurate information available for policymakers and individuals to make their own decisions. It's not a science question anymore. It comes down to people's personal choices. Getting vaccinated at this stage is a hugely important health measure for all of our communities. And then it's just a choice of available vaccines and personal risk-benefit analysis.
In Australia, there is real hesitancy about Astra Zeneca, I should tell you. You are the two people in the world who know what's in this vaccine and what it's capable of. Sarah, what's your message to all the Australians listening who haven't been vaccinated and who are worried about AstraZeneca?
Well, we know that the risk from the vaccine is really very low, and Australia has a very good alert system for reminding people to report symptoms once they've been vaccinated, and that helps to manage the condition when it does arise. So the policymakers in Australia are going to have to make their own recommendations based on the level of risk from the virus. But with the new variants that we have, they're spreading very rapidly. It's very hard to contain them. And I think that should be continually kept under review because we know that this vaccine is effective against the Delta variant, which is the one that's now causing problems very widespread around the world.
And there's a lot of questions about all the variants. We've had Alpha, Kappa, Delta. There's Lambda variant emerging. How does your vaccine perform against these variants? And are you working on it all the time, trying to adjust it? Can you do that?
Yes, it's very straightforward to put in a different version of spike protein into the adenovirus vector that we use. In the same way as we made the original vaccine, we can make new versions of it. What we are gathering information on is whether we actually need to do that, because we see that we get good protection against most of the variants with the original vaccine, and just giving a booster shot to increase the immune response increases the protection against all of the variants. So we don't anticipate being in a situation where we need to have lots of different versions of the vaccine and keep changing them. But we are wanting to be ready if a new variant arises that is really very different. We want to be ready to make a new vaccine against that version if it turns out to be needed.
In just over a week's time, the UK will have what's been called Freedom Day, where almost all COVID restrictions will be tossed out the door. What do you think of that plan, Sarah?
Again, a very complex decision. At some point, all countries are going to have to move on from applying restrictions to a new situation where we're living without the restrictions, and the difficult decision is when to make it. So at the moment, we're still waiting for the remainder of adults to be vaccinated, but there are concerns that if the restrictions are lifted too late in the year and we then start to have flu circulating at the same time as COVID, we may actually end up with a worse situation in the winter. So I'm glad that it's not my decision to make, because I think it's a very difficult one.
Catherine, this book is a fantastic insight into how to make a vaccine. You both do a great job in explaining it. And one of you, I think, is quoted in this book saying it's the story of how you made this vaccine as ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. In the book, you reveal, both of you, parts of your private lives, ordinary lives, two women with families and friends and camping trips and birthday parties and exhaustion, basically busting a gut for the rest of the world. Catherine, what motivates you to do that? Is it for the good or for the glory?
Nobody ever went into science saying, I want to be rich and famous, yeah? You do science because you want to help. You want to find things out, and ideally you want them to be useful. And we were in a situation in the early parts of 2020 when I and my team were in a position to be useful. We were the people in the right place at the right time, nothing more than that. And it came to us to deliver something big, and my team stepped up and they did it. And my friends and my support network stepped up so that we were able to do that. So it's all about getting a vaccine out there for the world, not just for the rich.
At one point in the book, you say you were asked by a journalist about being the only story in the world, and you say being the only story in the world felt like quite a heavy weight to bear. Was it unbearable at times, and could you do it again, knowing how heavy that load will be?
Next time, I hope we have learned from some of the things that we came across this time so we wouldn't have to do it again in the same way. And I think it's really important that we all as communities learn from each other. We can learn from Australia. You guys can learn from us to figure out that nobody would have to do it quite the same way again, because it was at times very arduous.
And let me ask both of you, what are the lessons to be learned from this pandemic to prepare us for what you and others believe is inevitable next time? Sarah?
Well, in the vaccine development, there were investments in infrastructure that we would have liked to have had made before 2020. Expanding and modernising Kath's manufacturing facility would have meant that that team could have made a lot more doses to go further in the clinical trials. There's a new manufacturing facility of a larger scale that's being set up in the UK to respond to outbreaks and pandemics, but it wasn't ready to use. Having a good, consistent supply of vaccines for the trials would have made our lives a lot easier. But we didn't have that because we hadn't had the investment in the infrastructure. So that's something that we really want to make sure does happen now, so that we're ready for a much easier time if we ever have to do this again.
And Catherine?
So there's also all of the add around things that go towards having to operate during a pandemic, which perhaps none of us had thought about prior to having to live it. So when you have key worker staff whose children need to be looked after, but schools are closed and public transport is difficult, and, you know, just our team need to work 16-hour shifts, but there's no food available on campus. And we talk about some of those things in the book about people helped us, but thinking about how we would join up PPE supply, everything, so that it doesn't grind to a complete halt right at the beginning, so that we can respond efficiently and effectively next time around. There's some societal structural things that I think we also need to remember not to forget next time.
Your book is called Vaxxers. Is that a clue to why you wrote it? Is this, in a sense, an ode or an answer to the anti-vaxxers?
I said, no, it's not a dig at the anti-vaxxers. It's a statement of the fact that the vaxxers are me and Sarah. We are the people that made the vaccine. It's not some amorphous conspiracy, consortium, global syndicate, yeah? It's me and Sarah, two regular people doing our jobs at the university, doing the best we can with the knowledge and expertise of our team. So the vaxxers are just ordinary women.
Catherine Green, Sarah Gilbert, congratulations and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just two regular people, a long way from that, as you can hear. Dr. Catherine Green is Senior Research Fellow at Exeter College in Oxford, head of Oxford University's Clinical Biomanufacturing Facility, and Sarah Gilbert is Professor of Vaccinology at Oxford University's Jenner Institute and the Oxford Project Leader for the Astra Zeneca Vaccine Project. Their book is called Vaxxers, The Inside Story of the Oxford AstraZeneca Vaccine and the Race Against the Virus. I have to tell you, they have a terrific talent for really explaining all the science and then the whole story itself, which is so fascinating.